Welcome to Video Game Genres, where your host Gexup provides you information you need to know about a certain number of video games put in a category. And tonight's episode of Video Game Genre is Metroidvania. In the mid-80s, since the Nintendo Entertainment System was launched, Nintendo made history with the success of revolutionary titles such as Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. After they were released, Nintendo decided to make a game that has Mario's side-scrolling platforming and Zelda's item collecting and exploration combined into one. On August 6, 1987, Nintendo has released Metroid, and this game was unlike any other 2D side-scrolling action platformer ever made. In fact, it became its own genre. But in that point in time, nobody gave a name for this subgenre that Metroid has made. But little did anybody knew that Metroid became very influential for the future it holds. Putting Metroid in the action platformer category does not describe Metroid's gameplay. Instead of going from point A to B like almost every other typical 2D platformer, Metroid sets off by giving you a non-linear world by leading the player to go in any direction. You can move anywhere freely, but you can't advance to some of the locations because you need to find the power-up/item in that area that are accessible to be in your location and use them to advance to continue your adventure. Many gamers at the time who played Metroid never expected that you can go left and find a morph ball power-up. Since Metroid's release, other games took the influence of its 2D free-roaming and power-up collecting. There were free-roaming item collecting games like the fans most hated, Castlevania 2 and Zelda 2, and really fantastic ones like Blaster Master for the NES, Wonder Boy series and Zillion for the Sega Master System, and so much more that I haven't played, but really deserve some attention. Many people compare those games to Metroid, and since they have similar gameplay, they made this unnamed subgenre a whole. Things started to get really epic when Super Metroid was released for the Super Nintendo, and gave us something beyond that was originated from the original Metroid. Believe me, this game was incredible to play because there was better power-ups, better action, better boss fights, more secrets, and so much more. But unfortunately, Donkey Kong Country was released the same year and it could not make the same hype and thus made poor sales despite being a better game. And since its release, we would not have another Metroid game until the series returns in Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion 8 years later. And thus, we would never see more games like Metroid's gameplay until the late 1990s when Konami decided to take the Castlevania series and change it on the Sega Saturn and later on the PlayStation. On Castlevania Symphony of the Night, the game has given back the gameplay, and finally this 2D non-linear free-roaming world of a subgenre finally has a name, which was made by Castlevania and Metroid fans alike, called Metroidvania. So any game that has a similar gameplay as to either Metroid or modern-day Castlevania games are automatically categorized as Metroidvania. To be quite honest, Metroidvania is a stupid word, but at the same time the word Metroidvania gets me excited for an adventurous 2D experience. But hey, at least it's better than Castleroid. Now let's talk about what all these games have in common and what made these games a subgenre. Well, first things first, no game could be a Metroidvania game without a non-linear 2D world. It should not be this point A to B gameplay where there are levels, but rather it should be this game style where it involves exploring the game's world and discovering paths that cannot be accessed with the player's current abilities. Finding an item, either a key or a power-up, later grants the ability to traverse the obstacle, allowing the player to backtrack and explore the new area at their leisure. Sometimes you can find these power-ups/items in certain areas, secret areas, or after a boss fight for that matter. These are the following reasons why these power-ups are very important. 1. The ledges or platforms the player cannot yet reach due to the length or height required for the jump. Often the power-ups which allow the player to bypass these obstacles improve the player's jump height or allow the player to jump in mid-air again in mid-jump. Other power-ups may allow the player to use nearby walls to jump, allow the player to automatically climb the walls, or in some cases they can fly. This is important because there are places to go besides left and right, but they also have these deep areas to fall into that makes jumping a chore, and the jumping/flying powers helps a lot, and also getting into high areas. 2. Destructible barriers the player cannot destroy with their current abilities. The sort of barriers are frequently associated with the weapons power-ups that the player acquires, allowing the player to more easily kill their foes as well bypass obstacles. Believe me, you will soon encounter bosses and enemies that will be so hard to kill that you need those power-ups in order to beat them. 3. Indestructible barriers the player must acquire a key to unlock or perform a task elsewhere to remove. Generally, these barriers are associated with boss fights, though occasionally the severe to form a shortcut. The player must reach the other side of the barrier to press the switch, which removes the barrier and allows the player to follow the passage, often for the purpose of allowing the player to traverse the game more quickly. And finally, number 4. Barriers aren't always the part that stops you from moving onward. When there are environments that the player cannot yet traverse without taking some ill effect or having their mobility severely hampered, or in some games like Wonder Boy, possibly not at all. The power-ups associated with the obstacle invariably remove the ill effects associated with the environment, like hot temperatures, underwater, grappling on walls, and so much more that needs power-ups to overcome these dangerous environments. An integral part of the experience is the exploration of the game world. It's pretty rare for the player to be told exactly where they have to go, with the exception of Metroid Fusion. Instead, the player must rely on their own sense of exploration to discover new areas and goals within the game. This can lead to frustration for experienced players, as sometimes the proper path to take to trigger the next event or gain new power-ups to avoid obstacles makes it feel like busy work, requiring the player to traverse the majority of the game in search of an item or a path that they overlooked. Metroidvania games can go in different directions: left, right, fall down on long falls and not get any damage from landing, or go up by jumping on platforms that's directing the way. They can return to any location they can get access to as they desire, and there are no limits in doing so. They can get HP and ammo from the enemies they destroy, and get additional hit points such as Metroid's energy tanks in the secret areas. But for some, like Castlevania, where they have RPG elements, it makes it feel really rewarding because the more enemies you destroy, the more experience points you get. And that way you can level up and get more HP and more. Since some Metroidvania games are so massive, a map is needed. Games like the original Metroid that doesn't have a map ends up in memorizing your surroundings. The map system is like blocks, rectangle shapes indicating where you are in the 2D world. They appear visible when you already visit the location, and everything else is uncharted and must be discovered if you were to put it in the map. Otherwise, if they showed everything in the map without being in each area already, would already spoil everything. Since this 2D platformer subgenre is so massive, saving and passwords must be needed because they cannot be finished in one sitting. So you would probably reconsider finding a save room at one point or the other. Some Metroidvania games have a time limit to give off multiple endings depending on how well you do. In this case, most gamers really love to play a Metroidvania game and speedrun the game and try to get the best time. Hell, many gamers try to beat many Metroid games' world record of having the best time. Speaking of which, are there any 3D Metroidvania games since there are many that are side-scrollers? Well, the name Metroidvania was made by fans who knew these games for being 2D. The only one that comes to mind are the Metroid Prime series, that is a Metroidvania in 3D, but everything else took elements from the subgenre. Like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, where there's a large world with firm subdivisions, where gaining new abilities advances your exploration. And in the original Metal Gear Solid, where Snake had to go back and get the sniper in order to defeat Sniper Wolf, was definitely elements from the Metroidvania subgenre. But just because they have elements is not part of the subgenre, and calling those games a Metroidvania game is totally inaccurate because those games are genres of their own. Don't get me wrong, after playing Metroid Prime, I know that there can be 3D Metroidvania games, but it's just that not that many games have platforming and open wide areas to explore and collectibles and power-ups like the traditional Metroidvanias. So I think it's better if a Metroidvania game is 2D because that's where the name originated from, and I don't think 3D games can follow the 2D top-down tradition, and most of all, it's supposed to be a 2D subgenre. I think most people don't really like to use the term Metroidvania is because when you're trying to play a game from the subgenre, you can't think of anything else besides Metroid and Castlevania out of your head while playing it. I mean, there are other games in that subgenre besides both of those series. In the indie scene, we have indie games like A Mini Falafel Adventure and Cave Story that carry on the Metroidvania tradition. And just last year, Shadow Complex brought the Metroidvania experience as a downloadable game, and today it is the best Xbox Live arcade game ever. And recently we had Castlevania Harmony of Despair, and since Metroid Other M is coming out, what better way to give tribute to the series than talking about the influence that started from the original Metroid. To wrap things up with this episode of Video Game Genres, here's a list of Metroidvania games that I've played that I strongly recommend. Metroid, Metroid 2, Super Metroid, Metroid Fusion, Metroid Zero Mission, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Castlevania Area of Sorrow, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, Castlevania Harmony of Despair, Shadow Complex, Blaster Master, Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap, Cave Story, and a mini falafel adventure. Even though there aren't many Metroidvania games, it's a concept that cannot be ignored. I hope that there will be more games like this in this subgenre, and I'm more than excited to try Metroid Other M to see the true old school style of Metroid third-person gameplay in the third dimension. And if you like what you just saw, give a thumbs up and please subscribe.